Welcome back to the Dirt Diaries, explorers. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss a new archaeology discovery episode or more. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to like and comment. It really helps me out. Don't forget to rate this 5 stars. Tell all of your friends about all of the fun history and archaeology facts. And if you are new here, welcome. I hope you enjoy archaeology, history, ancient history, mythology, and more as much as I do. Because my name is Dr. Teninger Kallenbarger, and I bring the ancient world to you. Because no, this is not Ancient Aliens. This is the real thing, and these, of course, are the Dirt Diaries. And of course, a special shout out and hello to those lounging in the villa, taking notes in the library, and snooping in the restricted section over on Patreon. And last time on Dirt Diaries, we really dove into it, pun intended, into the Titanic, as its 113th anniversary of its sinking just went by, and that was really interesting. I really enjoyed that, not only because the Titanic has been a hyperfixation of mine since I was a child, but it was really cool to go over the entire timeline with you guys. And if you guys have not watched the newest National Geographic documentary that came out about the new scans and the digital twin of the Titanic, highly recommend that you go ahead and watch that. And maybe in the future, I'll go back over another Titanic episode where we go over artifacts that were lost, including the Megalodon tooth or the statue of Artemis that was recovered, or other priceless pieces of art that went down with the ship. Go over more stories from passengers, survivors, victims, all of that kind of stuff, because I really like to bring history back into the modern day and age and really make history come alive one story at a time. And yeah, the Titanic will likely be the most modern history that we cover here on the Dirt Diaries because my specialties lie in antiquity. And if you are interested in an ancient shipwreck, might I turn you onto Dirt Diary Season 1. I'm blanking on the episode, but we dove into the Uluburun shipwreck, one of my favorites, as I said before. I will probably name another cat or animal or pet that I have Uluburun because it's such a fun name to say. I've gone over the Cape Caledonia wreck in Patreon as well, so you can go ahead and check out those ancient wrecks now. But today, we are getting back into our ancient history stuff because we are looking at ancient weapons. And we're looking at a few kinds, and we're really looking at, well, weapons that help showcase power in the ancient world, because it's not just about who you're killing and who's getting killed in the ancient world. It's about how you're killing and with what weapons you're killing with. And so really, I'm cracking open the ancient history books and my dissertation for this one. And this is a complete tangent, but when I got hooded and graduated with my PhD a few years ago, when my advisor was hooding me, they read aloud your dissertation title as you are shaking people's hands, getting hooded, all that good stuff. And I was savoring the moment, trying not to cry and everything. And my advisor is hooding me and laughing because my title was so dark, because my title was To Kill and to Be Killed, the transformation, transference, and use of the smiting pose in Egypt and the Aegean and the Bronze Age. And we were laughing because she whispered in my ear as she hugged me, "It's such a bloody title for such a happy day." And yes, but I couldn't think of a better title because, you know, even with posters or talks that I have done, or even the upcoming article that I have coming out, I love going for the to kill and to be killed or smite him down, all of that kind of stuff, because it's just so cool, because that's literally what the weapons are doing. They're smiting people down. And I just love it. So I hope you love these ancient weapons as much as I do. And we're talking everything from daggers to maces to perhaps mythical or weapons that don't exist. And of course, everybody's favorite, swords. So come with me as we travel over 5,000 years into the past as we talk ancient weapons. Alrighty, so to start, we gotta head back to ancient Egypt. Why are we heading to Egypt? Because we get evidence of the smiting scene, which of course includes weapons, from scenes in tombs over 5,000 years ago. So we gotta start there first. And we're really talking 3100 BCE to 3200 BCE. Again, it just really depends on the chronology you're going to be using. And 3100, 3200 BCE is way before the pyramids of Egypt are even thought about being constructed. We are over 600 years before the pyramid of Khufu is even imagined. And really, we're in the early dynastic periods of Egypt. Around this time, well, around 3100 BCE is where archaeologists are suspecting that Narmer is unifying both Upper and Lower Egypt together. But the tomb and everything that we're going to start with is right at that mark of Narmer and right before Narmer as well. So rather than Giza or Luxor, Valley of the Kings, Thebes, anything like that. So we're looking at the site of Nekhen. And Nekhen is the ancient Egyptian name. Its ancient Greek name is Hierakonpolis, but I much prefer the ancient Egyptian name, but if you like the Greek one, stick with it, but I will be referring to it as Nekhen. And this site is really important, not only for its very long history in the prehistory of Egypt, but all of the archaeological finds that have come out from this site specifically. And we're not just talking about the Narmer palette, we're talking about mace heads from Scorpion and so much more. And the so much more part also includes that of Tomb 100. Tomb 100 is super cool because of the painting that was found within. It covers a massive wall and it's so full of power poses of the time and really showcases how these early Egyptians were trying to figure out how they wanted to portray power. At 3100, 3200 BCE, already these Egyptians are wondering, how should we construct images of power? And Tomb 100 is a little bit earlier than the Narmer palette. And Tomb 100, for those wondering, is actually where probably the earliest smiting scene as we know it to be in Egypt is actually found on Tomb 100. And yes, we do see a weapon involved as well. And I love it. And it's one of my favorites. Although I will say that there might be some earlier interpersonal combat scenes where two individuals are using spears or lances. Not too sure, but it's not the same as the smiting pose that we see already in Tomb 100, and then the Palette of Narmer really formalizes that pose. But it's really interesting because Tomb 100 and even the Narmer palette belongs to the late Naqada period. So it's really, really fascinating. And of course, we can go into that whole period and everything another time. And yes, I said we had weapons. And what does our aggressor have here? But a mace. It's kind of hard to see, but it is not just a club. It's actually a mace due to the large mace head at the end of the stick. And this scene is actually, of course, one of many scenes on the wall of Tomb 100. And it's actually in the bottom left side of the scene. And it's very, very tiny. If you don't know it's there, you would probably miss it. If you didn't know that one of the earliest smiting scenes was there, you'd be like, wow, what a cool tomb painting carrying on in the museum. It's so crazy that it's right there, but it's so small. And in the rest of the scene, we see other depictions of hunting, of sailing, of the Master of Animals motif. I believe that one is it's in the right quadrant of the scene, but it's so cool nonetheless. And you're probably saying, if you're anything like me, internally about now, what the heck does this have to do with anything? And right you are. It's a great question to ask. Why else would we be here on the Dirt Diaries except to ask that question? Well, it's this small scene located in the bottom left-hand corner that would actually become the emblem and the formalized icon of pharaonic Egypt for thousands of years. It is really going to remain unchanged after Narmer. It's crazy. Really, the only changes that come about, and I'm going to enter academic blackout mode because this is partially like a huge section of my dissertation, but the only times we really see a change in the Egyptian smiting canon is Pharaoh Den, who is, going back to my Egyptian king list, I'm pretty sure Den is the great-grandson of Narmer. So it's still Dynasty 1 that we're looking at. But Den actually changes the smiting motif only a little bit. And if you didn't know where to look, you probably wouldn't find it. He actually showcases, rather than having both feet flat on the ground, the back foot is actually raised to showcase movement, like you're moving forward to smite somebody down. Now that's really the first change, and then from 1,000 years and some change, we do not see any other changes until really the New Kingdom, where we are seeing more interaction with a third character. This third character could be another enemy being smote down, or it could be the addition of a divine figure like Amun-Ra, Ra-Harakti, anything like that in the scene where they may be handing the pharaoh a divine weapon. We really don't see that come about until the New Kingdom, really late Dynasty 18 at its earliest, and then really Ramses II utilizes that and really changes everything. But there's only a few changes ever in the artistic canon for the smiting pose, but a fun little tangent nonetheless. And of course, Narmer creates this pose as a visual representation of militaristic propaganda, right? He is uniting Egypt, and you have to make sure that everybody knows that. And while everybody, of course, may not be able to read and write in the ancient world, what can everybody do? 99 times out of 100, they can look at art and they can understand it. As always, what I tell my students as well is a huge amount of the population is not going to be literate, but what can everybody do? See the art and visual narrative that is being presented to them. So moving on from Tomb 100 and really getting into the nitty gritty of Narmer, we're moving about a century and some change from 32 to 3100 BCE. And again, this just goes back to the chronology that you are following. We gotta talk about our buddy Narmer, because we get this beautiful Narmer palette, which, fun fact, is actually a lot bigger than you would actually think in person. But what do we notice front and center but our buddy Narmer wielding a mace, ready to pop somebody in the head? Now, the mace as a weapon actually becomes really the weapon of choice for pharaohs for quite some time. Really, the mace becomes the emblem of the pharaoh and the emblem of instilling order over chaos, if you will. And what's really interesting, outside of the mace really always being part of pharaonic iconography and imagery, is that the mace as a weapon goes throughout history being relatively unchanged. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, you know? If it's doing the job as a weapon, we don't really need to fix it and or change it. But there are 3 different types of mace heads. We have a conical shaped mace head, we have a hatchet shaped mace head, and of course, notched. And these different forms of the mace head are also going to affect the human body in different ways when you are using it to smite enemies down. But all in all, the blunt force trauma that is going to be given each time that this weapon is wielded is going to be devastating. So what is a mace? How is it really constructed? Well, a mace is really a mace head, usually made out of stone during this period, but it's really mace head, wooden handle. And in scholarship, there has been some suggestions that the mace as a weapon is really unreliable, and that as an unreliable weapon, it could come off as clumsy and would not have been the weapon of choice in aspects of close combat. Because remember, there's different ranges of combat. So long range combat, mid range combat, and of course, close range combat. And we see all 3 depicted in art during the ancient time period that we're talking about, mainly the Bronze Age. And studies of maces have actually shown that mace heads weighing just about 2 pounds could already cause devastating effects on the human body. Already at 2 pounds, going against the human body, it would create devastating effects, which is mind-blowing to me. But of course, how do you protect against this? Really, helmets and later armor would be constructed and go through different evolutions to protect the human body. Really, anytime a weapon is created in ancient history, the armor and, defensive weaponry would almost kind of evolve just about a step behind and say, okay, well, the mace can do this. Well, this helmet can protect you. So then all of the weaponry has to evolve again to make sure that you can beat that helmet. So that helmet has to evolve to now also have a shield and X, Y, and Z. So it's really interesting to also see that in history too. Now, were people really out on the battlefield swinging a mace around? Well, it's hard to say from the artistic evidence that survives from pharaonic Egypt. So when the pharaoh is shown ready to smite his enemy down with a mace, what's interesting is we are seeing almost a very ritualized scene, that the battle or war is already over and that the pharaoh is coming in to really ritualistically end everything, that it's almost a finishing weapon because the victim is usually on their knees, on the ground. The battle has already been, won for Egypt, lost for the enemy. And it's really fascinating that we're only really seeing it in these highly cultic, ritualized scenes. And when the pharaoh is shown, looking at his enemy, usually grasping their hair, and he's preparing to swing it down and, fatally wound the enemy, it's interesting because at that moment, the pharaoh is showing that the mace is really the weapon of the pharaoh, that the mace itself is instilling order over chaos. And the mace also has mythical associations to the god Horus. Remember, Horus is the son of Osiris, and he would go on to battle his uncle Set. And Horus also is known as Lord of the Mace who smites his foes. And of course, Egyptian pharaohs throughout pharaonic Egypt are seen as the human embodiment of the god Horus. They also receive a Horus name. And if we bring back the Narmer palette, Horus is actually shown really kind of assaulting the figure. And even before the pharaohs of unified Egypt, we get early rulers like Scorpion, and we actually, going back to the site of Nekhen, have ceremonial mace heads that are dated to his reign. And even the ceremonial mace heads that do belong to Scorpion, they really highlight, not only as a weapon, but the artwork depicted on it, how the mace is developing in royal iconography of the time, which is just so cool to me that over 5,000 years ago, early rulers were having to sit down and decide how they're going to showcase power over the rest of everybody at the time. I don't know, just these ancient conversations of how we're developing scenes of power, poses of power, all of this kind of jazz, and to really highlight order over chaos and your dominion over the rest of the world is so fascinating to me. This is why I love studying power poses, ancient weaponry, combat iconography, everything like this. So while the mace is one of the most popularized weapons that the pharaoh is shown smiting with, in the New Kingdom, the mace will slowly become replaced with the use of the Khopesh and the sword. And during these later periods, it's believed that the mace likely became a little bit more obsolete on the battlefield, but still maintained itself as a symbolic weapon of the pharaoh's might and power in art. So outside of the mace and the Khopesh, which we're going to be getting to in a little bit, we also have an interesting problem in the artistic canon of the pharaoh's might with ancient weaponry, and that is the bladed mace. Because the bladed mace is really cool artistically, but it's a huge problem for archaeologists, scholars, and art historians. Why, you might be wondering? Because the bladed mace has never been recovered in the archaeological record. We have no artifacts that have come out that look anything like how the bladed mace is depicted, and it really seems that the bladed mace only exists in art. So if they are only in art, what would these weapons look like? So scholars have deduced from artistic representations that these weapons are a round-headed stone mace with an inset blade in one of its sides. And they're gathering this from artwork that survives. And one of the earliest renditions of the bladed mace actually comes from Dynasty 12, and it's actually on a pectoral. And we see the pharaoh, of course, wielding it back like he's going to smite his enemy down with it. And we see that the blade is sticking out of the mace, and you can see it in the detail. Here, the blade portion of the bladed mace is actually inlaid with the dark blue lapis lazuli. Now, it's believed that when the bladed mace is being used, a stone or a bronze mace head would have held the blade in it. And what's also really interesting about the bladed mace is we only see it not only represented in art, but it's only ever seen in Egypt. We don't see artistic representations of the bladed mace outside of Egypt, which only adds to its mystery. And when we see it in Egypt, in the artistic representations, it's not alone like how we saw just the normal mace. Usually other weapons are paired with it. And the bladed mace can easily be seen in scenes of the pharaoh smiting, of course, in the later New Kingdom with Ramses II at Abu Simbel, and by Ramses III at Medinet Habu. So the pectoral, let's go back to that for a second. So the pectoral actually comes from Dynasty 12. This is in the Middle Kingdom. And this pectoral was discovered in the mortuary temple of Senwosret III. But it doesn't depict him. It in fact depicts the pharaoh Amenemhat III. Well, Senwosret III, he ruled during Dynasty 12. He was the 5th pharaoh of Dynasty 12. And his successor was Amenemhat III. And on this pectoral with the bladed mace, this is actually the only time during the the early dynastic, the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdoms that we actually see a change in the weaponry. We also see, of course, changes in weaponry during the New Kingdom. But for the first time, and Amenemhat is 19th century BCE. So already it's over 1,000 years later, and we're finally getting a change in weaponry for the smiting pose. All right, but the next time that we really see a change in the weaponry is going to be when we notice the Khopesh. And the Khopesh is a curved sword. It really resembles the scimitar, but functions quite differently. So the Khopesh is a sickle shaped, so curved. And of course, the sharpened blade is along the outer edge of the weapon rather than the inner edge of the weapon as we see with the scimitar. So the Khopesh's thin blade actually allows for a really interesting movement to be done with it. In fact, Khopeshes can be used in slashing axe-like movements. And the name of this weapon, the Khopesh, actually comes from its similarities seen with an ox's foreleg. I was just as shocked as you, which of course shares the same name, Khopesh. And this really did not come from Egypt. In fact, the Hyksos, during the Second Intermediate period in Egypt, they were the ones who likely introduced Egyptians to the Khopesh. And then, of course, the New Kingdom pharaohs, after they expelled the Hyksos, beginning Dynasty 18 in the New Kingdom, continued using the Khopesh throughout later dynasties. Thanks, Hyksos. We love that. And because the knowledge of the Khopesh came from the Hyksos, scholars believe that the knowledge of the Khopesh and this weapon actually came to Egypt from the land of Canaan or even from Mesopotamia. And likely this was as a form of tribute. So before the Hyksos introduced the Egyptians to the Khopesh, the Egyptians were actually using swords that were similar to long daggers. And these daggers were composed of a tapered, double-edged blade made, of course, either of copper or a copper alloy. Remember, we got to call it a copper alloy if we don't know if there's tin involved and that the ratio is 10-1 to make bronze. So copper alloy it is. So if it wasn't tin, what else could be used in copper alloys? Usually going to be arsenical copper. Copper really, we do have blades and tools made out of strictly copper, especially in the Aegean world. But if you are looking to use a weapon and looking to have it function well, you are going to need to add some alloy to the copper because copper on its own is a very weak metal. Again, it's not as weak as gold, but it's not going to hold up in combat. Alrighty, so now that we know, how the Egyptians were using some of their weapons, especially how they're being represented in art, especially in scenes of the smiting pose, we got to look at Crete because also, I know so many of you wanted me to talk about both Egypt and Crete, also Crete in the Aegean. With weapons, it was shocking to see that hundreds of you wanted more emphasis placed on Crete than just Egypt, which to me is shocking because I always think people want to talk about ancient Egypt and their weapons, but you guys are like, nah, we want Crete, we want the Aegean, we want the daggers, we want the swords of the Aegean. So to you, let's go ahead and dive in because now I can go ahead and fully academic blackout on Aegean weapons of the Bronze Age because it's one of my favorite topics. So with that, we can finally lock in. Okay, so on Crete, we really got to talk about daggers because there would be no swords without daggers and their typology and history within the Aegean. So, of course, metalworking in the Aegean, and especially on the island of Crete, the largest of all the Greek islands, has an extremely long history. In fact, it actually goes back. We have some evidence of metalworking that goes back to the final Neolithic period. You guys, it's crazy. But of course, during the early Minoan period on Crete, which of course is part of the early Bronze Age, we get daggers on Crete. Happy days. And these early daggers in Crete in the early Minoan period, early Bronze Age, they're really only made out of copper or copper alloy. And for the most part, a lot of these daggers are found buried next to individuals in tombs. But they are really only buried next to men, which at this period has led scholars to believe that daggers in the early Minoan period had ties to symbols of masculinity. And the dagger is super interesting in the Aegean and in Crete because the dagger has no precedence in any other type of material that we see on Crete. So there was no desire earlier on for people to make these daggers in ceramic, in obsidian, nothing. This truly almost seems like a local creation. So the daggers in the Aegean, well, the daggers on Crete, they can really be separated into two classes. So we have the triangular dagger, and then we have the long dagger. So we have the triangular dagger, which is exclusively Cretan. And then, of course, we have the long dagger, which can also then be divided into 4 subsections, subtypes. Yeah, subtypes, because there's 4 types. Can't even talk. I'm just too excited to talk about daggers. And the long dagger types, they are actually known, of course, on Crete and throughout the Aegean, but the triangular dagger is really only Cretan. And the triangular dagger, because of its shape, scholars have suggested that it was likely more delegated to scraping, spreading, and cutting rather than stabbing, which is really the main function of a dagger, so it likely was not used as weaponry. So the triangular dagger is actually super easy because it only comes in the one type, and it was really delegated to being a tool. There's an example of the triangular dagger, at least one of them that I'm pulling from my noggin, that does have a golden handle. I think it's in the Hanya Archaeological Museum today. And the triangular dagger, especially when gold is involved, it also could be a sign of status, wealth, all of that kind of cool stuff, which makes sense. But let's talk about the long daggers because we got 4 types that we got to dive into. So type 1. They either have a straight or a convex side with a round heel and usually 2 rivets. And they date to early Minoan 1A through early Minoan 2A. So if you're curious little chronology kitty cat, let's get those dates for you. So those dates are roughly 3100 BCE to 2650 BCE. And Type 1 and the shapes of Type 1, they're really comparable to what we are seeing from the island of Cyprus, Byblos, I believe, and more sites in the Near East, which is really, really cool. Type 2 has a more convex edge and also has a rounded heel with 2 rivets. And here, already at the start of Type 2, we are seeing early attempts to create a midrib in the blade. And how do we get a midrib on a blade? Well, this would have actually been achieved by repeatedly beating the blade. And type 2 has greater length in terms of the blade and piercing qualities than that of type 1. So already, type 2 is really building on type 1. And because of these achievements being done so closely to its creation after type 1, scholars are actually believing that if type 1 was foreign introduced, that type 2 was the Aegean's kind of rebuttal to type 1. Type 3 has a distinct central ridge, and these daggers, the issue with these daggers is because they were produced over such a long period of time, dating gets a little hard. Parallels for this type 3 dagger are seen in the Cyclades, so the Cycladic Islands, and as far away as Syria, which is so cool. So type 3, it seems that the Minoans were influenced probably by a Syrian dagger of the same typology, but then the Minoans, of course, adapted the blade to fit the needs of their people on the island of Crete at this time, which is really cool to me that all of these cultures, not only, of course, they're in contact with one another, but they are seeing what everybody is producing and they're saying, okay, we see you have this, but we're going to add X, Y, and Z because that's going to fit our people better, which is just so cool. Type 4 is very similar to type 3, except in the shape of the heel. And the heel change appears to be exclusively from the Aegean, as there is no evidence of this type of dagger with this type of heel anywhere else in the Aegean or the Eastern Mediterranean during this time. And the type 4 dagger cannot be dated to earlier than the early Minoan II period. So already type 1, 2, 3, 4 are kind of happening very quickly within one another. So of course, we all know or figure that daggers are differentiated from swords based on, of course, the length of the blade. Fair assumption, right? Well, you'd be correct. But this is where things kind of get tricky and nuanced, because when we're talking about swords versus long daggers versus daggers, length comes back to length. So for me and my work, blades that are 30 centimeters or larger, unhafted, so it's just the blade, not the tang, not including the handle, just the blade. So 30 centimeters unhafted, I will actually consider or hear them out to be swords and to qualify them as such. And if they are not 30 centimeters, they're below 29 and below, they will automatically, in my book for my research, be considered as daggers. Now, that's not to say that every blade that is 30 centimeters and over is instantly, boom, sword. No, you don't get that graduation status instantaneously. There's going to be other aspects that we will look into, but 30 centimeters unhafted is really the starting point. And I know it, and I can probably see it happening right now. Some people who are listening are instantly going to be saying, oh, that's not a sword. 30 centimeters, bah! How dare you call that a sword? That's just a long dagger. To which I will reply to you, pish posh, and I welcome discourse. So go out there and publish about unhafted blades being over 30 centimeters. I welcome that. But you know, when we're looking at the early development of swords coming out of daggers, long daggers in Crete during this early portion of the Bronze Age, we got to start somewhere. I can hear it now. 30 centimeters. Anywho, why? Because swords are not simply longer daggers, because their length actually becomes a principal factor in the overall functionality and design of the weapon as a whole. They're not just longer daggers, they're so much more than that. And if we are looking at, perhaps one of the earliest places where we could potentially see one of the earliest evidence of a short sword, that actually comes from the early Minoan cemetery site of Ayafotia on the north coast of Crete. And in this cemetery, A double-edged blade was recovered in tomb 216 near a human skull, and the double-edged blade actually measures 31 centimeters long. Here we see a clear midrib section, and we also see that this was added with an extreme tapering of the blade. Now, all of these characteristics are also characteristics of the type A sword in the Aegean world. But just because this blade at 31 centimeters has some of the characteristics of a type A sword, it doesn't fully fit a type A sword, but it also doesn't fit being a long dagger. So in one of my early reports, I have proposed, hey, this could be an attempt, an early Minoan attempt at a short sword. And if we are qualifying it as a short sword, it's super interesting because already during the early Minoan period, we're already seeing an active desire from these people to have a longer weapon that was functioning differently from the longer dagger forms that were already available during this time. So now that we're moving on to swords, some of the earliest finalized swords of type A are actually found from the site of Malia. And the one I'm showing you guys is probably considered to be the first type A sword in the Aegean world. This thing is massive. This thing is, I think, 100 centimeters. Just the blade. You're swinging a meter stick. And this thing, you are not swinging this puppy for any sort of combat. If anything, this is what we are really referring to as ritual. You are not bringing this puppy out on the battlefield. Oh my gosh. But this is the one that has the really cool crystal knob. And she's gorgeous. She's one of my favorites. But we ain't bringing her out on the battlefield. No. The incredible amount of strength it would have taken to, if you missed, to bring it back up in the air. This is a great example of swords really being relegated and delegated to the ritual sphere, is because if you don't connect with your opponent on the first strike, you're a sitting duck. But let's continue. So the finalized type A sword is really seen from the site of Malia. And of course, on the mainland, we also see type A sword being finalized at the site of Mycenae. And early swords for the Aegean world, specifically at the early portion of the late Bronze Age that, my specialty lies in, the sword types that we get are really type A and type B. I've also seen, this is a tangent, I've also seen some discourse on the sword type seen in the Pylos combat agate. I've seen discourse that it could be a type C or D, but I think because of the horned hilt, I'm a little bit more conservative in my guess that it is a type B. But that's just me. Anywho, so type A and type B. And really George Caro from the 1930s, he is a great source on this. The only caveat with that before y'all bum rush George Caro is it's all in German. So Caro, he really breaks down these two sword types really beautifully. So type A. What is type A for Caro? Well, he describes type A swords as those which are long and narrow in their blades, and of course, they are made out of bronze. In some cases, the handles are gold-plated, and many of these examples are best preserved and seen from the shaft graves from Mycenae. But of course, George Caro isn't the only scholar who has weighed in, right? We have Sanders, we've got Barry Malloy, love Dr. Malloy, and more. So since the 30s, more people, of course, have been weighing in on other characteristics of the type A sword. And for the most part, it has been agreed that the finalized type A sword really came about in the Aegean during the Middle Minoan II period, from Malia, and from the Middle Helladic II period, if we're looking at the mainland from the side of Mycenae. So looking at dates, we're looking at 1750 BCE. And type A swords are long. They range anywhere in their blade lengths from 70 to 100 centimeters long. Again, you are swinging a meter stick. You best, if you're taking this out on the battlefield, you best connect with your enemy on the first shot. But we also have some examples where the sword lengths are over 100 centimeters as well, which is just crazy to me. But of course, at the other end of that scale, we also have examples of type A swords that are way underneath 100 centimeters too. So not everything is that long. And these swords, a lot of type A swords that are underneath this larger scale, a lot of them have been recovered actually from the Arkelahori cave on Crete. The sword's shoulder was usually rounded with a high midrib in a rhomboid shape. And sometimes on the type A swords, we actually get a lot of beautiful decoration on the midribs. And this form was more slender and lighter than any long dagger on Crete and was a Cretan invention. So yes, if they were found on the mainland, they were likely produced by Minoan metalworkers. But with type A, probably heard me say this before, but with type A, we get fragility issues. And these issues actually arise in part due to their length, as well as the short tangs of type A. And you might be wondering, what's a tang? A tang was actually used to strengthen and elongate the blade. And as you can see in the image, it is usually this little tail of the blade, and the tang is usually covered by the handle. But with the type A, we also see that it seems like these early peoples were recognizing these issues were occurring. And so in some instances, the tang was elongated and thickened to help with these issues, but this was not standardized across the board. Other issues that arise from type A include percussive force and strain to the user and the blade. Of course, we talked a little bit about percussive force issues in the Mycenae episode. So, percussive force, let's dive back into it. Percussive force is caused by sword on armor, sword on any other type of weaponry, both offensive and defensive. And percussive force would have actually caused damage to the type A swords because of this. And they would be damaged because of the length of their blades. So again, I'm gonna get my brushes. So again, if we're looking at sword on sword percussive force, if the blades, if these are both type A, depending on where you hit, if it's too high on the sword blade, where it's too thin and there's not enough strength in the blade, it will actually crack that blade, break the sword, anything like that. But let's say it is a sword against a helmet or armor. Same thing. We're having the same issue. So type A can be pretty vulnerable in that sense. And then we also have the issues of weight within the sword. So again, let me grab my trusty sword brushes. And with the weight actually being placed higher up than the handle where you're holding it, both the rivets in the handle and the wrist and the elbow of the user is going to be strained because of where the weight is placed in the sword. But although there would have been some strain on the user with where the weight was placed on the blade, a heavy forward-weighted blade allows for versatility with its created inertia. This weight thus enhances movements like long-range cutting, thrusting, slashing, and wide circular slashes. And this versatility of type A, while really cool and allowed for the user to unleash a plethora of slashing on their enemy, it of course comes with cost, because everything comes with cost here. It would have really slowed the user down. These would have been slower movements, and with the massive slashing techniques used, would have required longer recovery in between attacks, suggesting that this sword type would have likely been used in duels or one-on-one combat. It has also been suggested that this weapon type, type A, may have been used for violent, ritualized scenes of combat, as this sword type lacked really any depth for cutting attacks. So at best, if this is used in a ritualized setting, people would be getting cut and everything, and blood would be spilling, but it would kind of be ending like that. We wouldn't be seeing a lot of fatal attacks. But if you wanted to inflict the most damage with type A swords, you would have needed to use a thrusting technique rather than a chopping one. And it's really interesting because as scholars who, we study how the body's being used and viewed and everything, really in art, the most common way that we see fatal attacks being done is that the victor will aim for the soft tissue in between your shoulder and your neck right here. Why? Because this is really the one area where your helmet and your other defensive weaponry and armor is not going to cover you. So usually when we see smiting scenes on the mainland or from Crete, we see it going in here, which is really, really cool and will always lead to a fatal attack. So its later counterpart, Type B swords. These swords actually come way after the already well-established Type A sword, most likely beginning around the Middle Minoan III period or the Middle Helladic III period, which is roughly 1700 BCE. For Type B, in some cases, we get very decorated and ornamented midribs, and these midribs are going to be broader than Type A. And what's interesting is with all of the handles and nail heads surviving from Type B, we actually see more nail heads of Type B that are gold plated as compared to Type A swords. So Type B swords as compared to Type A swords are automatically shorter. And Type B swords rarely ever exceed 60 centimeters in length. These swords are stouter with broader and longer tangs, which are now fully developed, which allows the handle to be strengthened and allows these blades to survive issues of percussive force. And this strengthening shifts the blade's balance towards the hand, reducing stress on the user's wrist and their elbow, which, great. Thank you, Type B. And this also increases the number of swings the user could take and reduces the recovery time that you would likely have to take in between all of your swings. And all in all of this really showcases that the Type B swords functioned vastly different than Type A swords. And swords, not only are they really cool just on their own, but they represent in the Aegean the first tools made deliberately for interpersonal combat. I'm sure some of you are saying, well, what about daggers? Yes, they can be used for interpersonal combat, but they're really only seen in close range combat. And with the triangular dagger on Crete, they were also created for images of prestige and masculinity, as well as for tools and all of that kind of stuff. But swords is really when we are seeing something else entirely. And with daggers, if we are seeing it for close range combat or combat in general, daggers are always, especially in artwork depicting interpersonal combat, depicting martial iconography, daggers are always paired with another weapon type. I have not seen any imagery of martial iconography where the dagger is placed alone. One of the earliest images of combat scenes that we have from Crete actually has two individuals fighting each other with daggers, but in their other hand is likely a bow. So already, daggers are never seen on their own as compared to swords. Swords, more often than not, are only paired by themselves, especially when we get into the topic of the victorious warrior. Victorious warrior is not even wearing a helmet or even using a shield. It's literally just a man and his sword. And swords, unlike daggers, are also better suited for group combat as well as single combat, one-on-one, all of that kind of stuff. But also, with the victorious warrior motif and even ideology in the Aegean, on Crete, and the mainland, we will really see group combat be 2 versus 1, 3 versus 1, or 1v1. It's never 2v2, anything like that. So whatever the reason for the creation of the sword, really the why of the creation of the sword, Its martial aspects demanded new intensive training to effectively use this weapon. Why? Because the act of grasping the sword involves much more of a mechanical process of the body, as it is an awareness of not only oneself, but also your surroundings as well. And without proper training, the fragile designs of the swords would hinder the user and never allow for the full effect of them to ever be reached. And with type A swords specifically, too much torsion would result in the bending or even the breaking of the blade. Training was, of course, needed in the Bronze Age for these warriors and their swords to really function together, for the swords to almost inherently become a functioning extension of the warriors themselves. Now, once we get the sword, imagery of the sword and the warrior already begins to take shape on Crete and the mainland almost instantly. It really comes about during the late Minoan 1 period and the late Helladic 1 period that we're really seeing images of warriors and swords popping up. And here in the Aegean, including the mainland, the sword was a weapon that was symbolically charged, as it was indicative of both status and may have marked the individual as heroic or an elite warrior and part of an elite warrior class that was emerging on both Crete and the mainland. And where daggers were a marker of masculinity and masculine identity, swords exclusively characterize high-ranking warriors and that elite ideology. Of course, the shaft graves at Mycenae and the tombs and graves around the site of Pylos, like that of the Griffin warrior where the Pylos combat agate was discovered, represents the internment of a handful of elite individuals over the course of a century or more. And these graves may not represent realistic militaristic aspects of these early Mycenaean states, Mycenae and Pylos, but they may rather represent the elite warrior ideology and perhaps even that these warriors were striving to become this victorious warrior. And already from the grave goods and everything, we are seeing that these cultures and societies idealized martial values. And from the grave goods found in the shaft graves of Grave Circle A, wealth and prestige may have been interconnected with certain military aspects. And when weaponry is found in graves or in burials, inherently, we all want to say the individual was a warrior, right? They were a great warrior, they were a hero. We all want that. But when weapons are found in burials or tombs, a warrior identity is not always the answer, but rather that individual's social representation was somehow tied to their sword, to their weapon, which is really, really cool, especially when we get into killing weapons and how weapons are also killed next to their owners and brought into the afterlife with them. I love that. And the elite nature of swords allowed them to be both a signifier of wealth as well as a marker of military prowess as they followed their owner into the afterworld. Swords not only allowed for the emergence of an elite warrior class who trained in specialized weaponry, but they also allowed for the victorious warrior iconography to thrive. Swords were created by early Minoan people, and in turn, the sword created a new social elite. And that, my dear friends, is some Bronze Age weaponry that I, of course, specialize in. And there is so much more I would love to dive into, such as helmets, helmet types, plumes, shields, shield types, jewelry of warriors, all of that kind of stuff, dressing the warrior, if you will. There's a lot of great articles out about that. And, how archaeologists are really trialing ancient weaponry today. But yeah, so this is just a tasting of, some of my favorite weapons, from Egypt, of course, into the Aegean world. I love swords, but, it's not always about what we find in the ground, right? It's not always just about finding, mace heads or swords in graves and saying, oh, that person was a warrior. But it's about looking at the larger picture itself, right? It's about looking at how these individuals interacted with these items, how these items in turn shifted cultural needs, cultural desires, and perhaps even constructed or reconstructed, warrior aspects, especially when we focus on the victorious warrior, because that is what I am currently working on. I have an article that is coming out that is actually I'm trying to think of how to say this. It is actually breaking down the different characters that we see in martial iconography scenes in the Aegean world, breaking down the characters, and I am actually proposing qualifications for when we should be calling certain characters the victor, the victim, the victorious warrior, the fallen figure, all of these kind of stuff. So it is my hope that, in my own field, we can already begin to reconstruct how we're viewing things and all of that kind of cool stuff. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys want another ancient weaponry episode? Should I do helmets, shields, and more? Oh, maybe I'll do some about when women are shown with swords, because it's really, really interesting that while there are some graves in Grave Circle A and I think Grave Circle B where women are buried with swords, are they actually warriors, or are we seeing that they are performing more of a ritualistic aspect with swords because of wall paintings that we do find? Let me know what you guys think. I could talk about weapons till I'm blue in the face, till the cows come home, but this was super fun for me. You guys are the greatest as always, and as you all know here from Dirt Diaries, keep your books open, stay curious, and I will see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.